My mom is superstitious. She has always adhered to silly, nonsensical rules like not stepping on cracks or tossing salt over her shoulder if you spill it, rules that may or may not have any true origin or reason. These are things people follow blindly, even though we all know there are no consequences for breaking them. One of my earliest memories involves my mom nervously demanding I hold my breath until she says otherwise. I don't remember where we were coming home from late at night, but Mom and Dad were in the front seat, and I was in a car seat, half asleep. Suddenly she said urgently, "Jason, hold your breath." She'd smack Dad on the arm. "You too, please. Just do it." Then she'd gulped in a big breath and held it as we traveled down the foggy night road. Once she released her breath and said, "Okay," my dad laughed. He was used to her superstitions and normally just went along to make her happy. "Why'd I have to hold my breath, Mommy?" I'd asked. Mom swiveled in her seat to look at me. "Because we were getting ready to pass a graveyard. Didn't you see it?" I hadn't seen it, which I was glad about. "It probably would have spooked me out." I shook my head. "Well, anytime you pass a graveyard at night, you must hold your breath until you make it safely past." I frowned and wrinkled my nose. "You do? Why?" I asked. She gave me a serious look. "Son, you just do, that's why. To be safe. That's why it's so important to always pay attention to your surroundings." Sometimes I think back to that and laugh a little. To think it's important to pay attention to your surroundings for the sole purpose of knowing when you're passing a graveyard. It's sort of funny. Do you know what it takes to get hired at a graveyard? Like as a job? Well, actually, in my case, it took exactly no effort. It took my dad drinking coffee with the city workers at the local diner on Sunday mornings and volunteering me when they said they needed a part-time groundskeeper. I didn't particularly care for the idea, but I did like money. And spring had come, so the weather was getting pretty nice. So I guess I didn't mind too much when I started working Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays after school, and Saturday mornings at our town's small cemetery. I'd go and prune bushes, pick up fallen tree limbs, cut the grass, and weed-eat carefully around tombstones. I was a teenager, but I was a pretty nice kid. I felt respectful of the place's residents, and I treated the grounds with proper reverence. I even came to enjoy the job. Sometimes when I came, there would have been a funeral earlier in the day. The casket would be lowered into the ground, and the mourners would be gone by the time I arrived. But the grave would be uncovered, with a pile of dirt still next to the chasm in the earth, waiting to be filled in. Or I would arrive on a Saturday to find a grave or two dug, a deep, perfect rectangle, awaiting a funeral later in the day, yet to have a casket lowered in. I hated to admit it, but I always liked the smell of the freshly dug graves. It generated a natural, earthy scent. Sometimes I felt the graveyard smelled old and stale, and also a little like an old lady due to the mixture of flower arrangements both growing and wilting away. It was probably all in my head. I supposed it was normal to just think that a graveyard smelled odd because a graveyard was an odd place. Nonetheless, I liked the ageless smell of the freshly turned earth. I never saw anybody digging the graves. Month after month passed, and I never caught a glimpse of anyone doing it. I also wondered why the graves were left open after a funeral. Why didn't the gravedigger come and fill it in right away? It seemed sort of eerie and maybe a safety hazard. Normally I was alone in the graveyard during my short shifts, but once in a while I would cross paths with another city worker who'd come in on some errand or task. The guy who sort of ran the graveyard, if that's a thing, was a grumpy old guy who never had much to say. One Saturday morning I asked him about the gravedigger. "Hey George," I asked, "how come you never see the person who digs the graves around here?" We were in a small office next to the main mausoleum, and George's eyes shot up from the stack of papers he was shuffling through. kind of question is that he grunted. I shrugged. I dunno. Just curious, I guess. George gave me a sharp look, staring at me for a second. He works at night, he finally barked. Oh, always. Like he never needs a night off to work in the day instead. He was glowering at me then. Boy, it's a job for the nighttime. Now, if you ain't got nothing to do, I reckon you can just skedaddle. From then on, I got sort of obsessed with the gravedigger. Thinking of it as a job that had to be done strictly at night made it all the more strange and alluring to me. Who was this person? What had drawn him to this sort of work? What was he like if he'd been spending a lot of time at night, all alone, digging graves? What did he look like? Why? Why on earth did he do this? I talked to my friend Jacob about it. I told him one day about all the open graves that popped up in the morning, what grouchy old George had told me about the night gravedigger, and my general fascination with this person. Jacob stared at me blankly. Dude, you're nuts, I laughed. Seriously, I think working in the graveyard has gotten to you. I need to tell your parents to make you quit that job, I chuckled again. Nah, it's a surprisingly okay job. Nothing creepy or like crazy making has ever happened. I bugged out my eyes and lurched at him playfully. He ducked out of my way. Seriously, though, I continued. Don't you ever think about what certain jobs are like? Like being a garbage collector or an NFL football player? Those are two really random selections, but yeah, I guess I kind of think a lot about law enforcement. I might like to go that route when I'm older. See, that's exactly what I mean. You think about jobs and wonder about what the job is like, and maybe about what sorts of people do certain jobs, right? Jacob shrugged. Yeah, I guess. Seems legit. So yeah, then you get what I'm saying. You're already thinking about a law enforcement career. What I want to know is, who wakes up one day and goes, boy, I really feel passionate about pursuing a career in the field of digging graves. Jacob cracked up laughing. Okay, yeah, I guess I see your point. So the guy never comes around except late at night? There's literally no way you could get to meet him, I don't think so. So I guess you have to go there at night then. I frowned. There is no way I could get out late at night unnoticed. And anyway, it's illegal to go into a cemetery past dark if you don't work there, dude. You do work there, Jacob informed, rolling his eyes. Well, I mean, it wouldn't be my time to work, so it wouldn't be okay for me to be there. And anyway, don't you think it might kind of freak him out if someone just showed up late at night? Jacob thought about it for a minute. Well then, I guess your only option if you really wanted to get a look at this guy would be to install a camera, what I cried. Sure. Like a little motion-activated camera. Like a Ring doorbell or something. Just put it somewhere that it most likely won't be noticed, and then it'll just kick on when someone moves near it. That sounds sort of stalkery, Jacob shrugged. You sound sort of stalkery, dude, wouldn't that be pretty sketch? Like, don't you think we could get in trouble for this? Jacob asked with a laugh. I mean, I suppose you could get in trouble. But the trick would be to leave it somewhere low-key and then get rid of it once you're satisfied. And if someone finds it and bothers to trace who it belongs to, which they probably wouldn't, then you could just make up something about being worried about vandals and trying to do a community service. Wow. Great idea, I exclaimed. You have sort of a criminal mind for someone who wants to be a cop. Hey, well, maybe that'll make me an excellent cop. Within the next week, we had gotten hold of a small motion-activated camera and set it up to notify my phone when it was triggered. I happened to know that a funeral was scheduled for that Saturday, so I planted the camera where it would be triggered near the site of the new grave. Jacob planned to spend the night at my house so we could finally see this mysterious person. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. That night, after my parents had gone to bed, we snuck to my room and stared intently at my phone, waiting for a notification. We must have fallen asleep because my phone startled us awake, buzzing violently. "It's going off," Jacob shouted. I grabbed my phone and brought up the camera feed. We could see something faintly. Something was definitely moving, and then we could see a figure emerge into view. He wasn't terribly far from the camera, but we still couldn't make out his face. "I'll try to enhance it," Jacob offered. He reached over me and tapped my phone. The screen brightened, and the camera zoomed in closer. Jacob and I sat and stared. The figure was bent over, doing something with the ground. The way he moved looked so strange. He wasn't using a shovel like I'd expected. He seemed to be clawing at the ground with his hands, digging vigorously. "What's he doing?" Jacob whispered. "I don't know," I whispered back. "He's not digging with a shovel," Jacob stated the obvious. "I don't know why," I said, keeping my eyes glued to the screen. Suddenly the figure stopped digging and stood up straight, and we could make out the rest of him. His hair was long and scraggly, and his clothes looked like they were torn and dusty. His eyes looked dark, even though he was standing a decent distance from the camera. He took a deep breath, stretching his mouth wide as he breathed in. Jacob and I looked at each other, freaked out but fascinated. "Why is he doing that?" Jacob asked. "Doing what I wanted to know. Breathing in so deeply like that. Oh, maybe he's catching his breath. He's been digging for a while." We stared for a few more minutes as the figure went back to clawing at the ground. He was taking great swipes at it with his hands, and dirt was going everywhere. Suddenly, there was a dull thud and a loud screech from the phone. "Ah," Jacob and I both cried. "What was that?" I exclaimed. "I don't know," Jacob yelped. We stared back at the camera to see the figure was hunched over the grave again, and then he was reaching down to pick something up. "He's holding something," I whispered. We leaned in closer to the screen. "Is that?" I gasped, my voice sticking in my throat. That looks like I couldn't finish the sentence. Jacob was staring open-mouthed. The figure stood up again, this time holding up what looked like a long, thin rod. It took us a moment to realize what it was: a bone. He held it up and looked at it, then slowly turned his head in our direction. He looked directly into the camera, and we could see his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Jacob and I both let out startled gasps and nearly dropped the phone. The figure started to move towards the camera, and we scrambled to turn it off. "What is he doing?" Jacob whispered frantically. "I don't know," I whispered back. "We have to go see," Jacob urged. I shook my head. "No way. That's crazy. Come on, we have to go. We can't just leave him there." Jacob insisted. We grabbed our flashlights and hurried downstairs, trying to keep as quiet as possible so as not to wake my parents. We crept outside and made our way to the graveyard. As we approached the area where the camera was set up, we could see the figure in the distance. He was still standing near the open grave, holding the bone. We hesitated, unsure of what to do next. "Should we call the police?" I asked. "No, let's just see what he does," Jacob replied. We watched as the figure slowly lowered the bone back into the grave and began to cover it with dirt. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if he was performing some kind of ritual. Once he was done, he stood up and looked around, seeming to take in the surroundings. Then, without warning, he turned and started walking towards us. "We need to hide," Jacob whispered urgently. We ducked behind a nearby tree, trying to stay out of sight. The figure passed by, and we held our breath, hoping he wouldn't notice us. He continued walking, and we breathed a sigh of relief once he was out of sight. "Let's get out of here," I whispered to Jacob. We made our way back home as quietly as possible, both of us shaken by what we had witnessed. The next day, we went back to the graveyard to retrieve the camera. As we approached the area, we noticed that the grave was completely covered up, and there was no sign of the figure. "Do you think it was all just a dream?" I asked Jacob. "I don't know," he replied. But I think we should keep this to ourselves for now, we agreed, and went our separate ways, both of us unsure of what we had seen. From that day on, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease whenever I passed by the graveyard. I couldn't shake the feeling that the gravedigger was still out there, watching and waiting. I used to work at a video store in Los Angeles in the 90s. We had quite a few celebrity customers, including some porn stars. It was a wacky work environment that could feel pretty unsafe at times, but that unpredictability was half of the allure. I honestly loved the job and the crazy, unhinged customers that came with it. There was a porn star who would come in frequently. I'll call her T, whose visits I would absolutely dread. She only seemed to come in when I was working alone. She would always ask me the same question: which of my movies do you carry? Now, she didn't ask this in any kind of unreasonable manner. T was a little older, clearly had a whole career behind her. She looked and acted a little crazy, like she was out of her mind, but she was also very obviously high. She'd come in grinding her teeth together, and her eyes would bulge out of her head like they were some prosthetic special effect. She was skinny from years of substance abuse and probably various personal issues with weight and image. She also reeked of booze and cigarettes most of the time. She would scream, "Which of my movies do you carry?" over and over again with that crackhead energy. I repeatedly told her that our computer system would only look up movies by title, not by actors or actresses, but this fact never seemed to get through to her. Every time she would start screaming at me. Remember, this was around 1995, so the computer I used to look up things and check rentals was a dinosaur. But it didn't really matter because T would always forget. "How in the hell can you find out which of my movies you have?" she would scream. I offered to walk her back to the adult section so she could see the stock on the shelves for herself, but she would always scoff, totally disgusted at that idea. This was bewildering because she was a porn star who had already come into the adult film store. "I'm not going in there," she yelled. "Lady, you're already in here. What's it going to hurt to go scan the shelves real quick?" In my head, I'm thinking she's a porn star and won't walk the aisles and look at the covers. It made me think she was even crazier than she was letting on. What did she think she'd find in there? Just how out of touch with reality was this woman anyway? She would yell at me for a bit before calming down and then leaving, but this scene played out at least a dozen times. She wasn't the worst customer I had, but she became the one that I dreaded the most. Then, one week, she didn't show up. Monday, Tuesday, the whole week went by and still no tea. It was a huge relief, but part of me wondered if something bad happened to her. Was she getting extra spun out and would come in even crazier? The reasonable side of me figured she had moved on. Another week went by without her presence, and she left my mind entirely. Fast forward a month or so. Guess who comes slithering through the double doors? It's T, and she looks like hell. First off, she clearly hasn't showered for several weeks, maybe since the last time I saw her. You could always tell when she was really unwashed because her hair would just get more and more vertical. I don't know how else to explain it other than the grease would just hold up this overly dyed, frazzled hair. Her clothes were about the same as always, nightwear and half sporty Valley mom. All of this is nothing when I see her face though. She has a huge black eye, and her eyes themselves are just completely insane. She's got pupils like dinner plates, and the outer rim, instead of white, is tinged with a deep yellow. I can't tell if she's sick or more hungover than any human I've ever seen. She comes to the counter and sparks up that same shtick she always does. "What movies do you have? Where are they? How many copies?" I try to be a little personable and say, "Hey T, it's been a while since I've seen you. We still don't have an updated system that allows me to search those specifics. I can show you the shelves that might help you though." I'll never forget the look she gave me, just this faraway nod, half smile with her mouth all jittery. She asked me if I was sure, to which I said yes. Then she started backing up towards the exit. Unsure of what was going on, I figured she was in the middle of an episode. She'd see herself out and probably disappear for another few weeks. I'd heard of mentally ill people being stuck in loops of behavior. Maybe visiting the video store was part of her loop. Boy, how wrong was I. The door opens not 30 seconds later, and a big, tall, sharp-dressed guy strolls in. I extend a welcome but hesitate. This guy looks pissed. He's storming right up to the counter. I ask if there's anything I can help him with. He sets his hands on the countertop, and they're bling-studded with all kinds of gold and silver, crusted diamonds in between them. He calmly explains that I'm the problem, and that he's here as a solution. I start to come back with something about how I'm just at work, just an employee here. If he wants the cash in the register or the pornos in the back, he can have them. The guy laughs at me, shakes his head, then explains that I'm just upsetting his friend who was just in here. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. T, the crazy cracked-out porn star who's been pestering me for months, somehow secured backup. I tell him that I don't know her at all. She's just a needy customer who wants to find her films. There's not an easy way for me to do that, so she'll just have to look over the titles herself. This guy cuts me off with a wave of his hand, says he knows. He's heard every word. He's heard it so many times that he feels like it's happening to him, and now he needs to get involved. It turns out T was pretty much what I pegged her for. This guy was clearly gang or drug related, maybe even a kingpin. He acted like he was T's handler, almost like a pimp or something. She was so old there was no way he had her tricking. I mean, I guess there's a market for anything, but I got more of the vibe that he had a relationship with her and for himself. Whatever the case, it's now my problem. I'm looking up at this Coke machine of a man, deciding if I should hit the security button. This is just a video store, so part of me didn't even think that would work. But it was down at the other end of the counter, and if I moved, this guy was going to snatch me up for sure. He states T's full name, then her stage name. They were similar, probably more similar than you'd want them to be. I realized then that T was probably pretty easy to look up in the phone book if you were clever enough. He then asked me, which movies do you have with her in them? Obviously, he didn't want the same excuses I'd given before, so I threw my hands up in defeat. I logged into the computer beside me, pulled up the inventory list of the entire store, and started doing it the old-fashioned way. I jotted down a short list of titles that I recognized and just started from there. It took me almost an hour to find every single tape, constantly double-checking the shelves and discount racks for hidden copies. The whole time, that guy just casually followed me around, not saying a word, just watching me gather them all up in a tub on the counter. He'd crack his knuckles, roll his neck, textbook intimidation stuff. It was like a scene from Goodfellas. It was only after I started to pile up all the tapes that I realized just how extensive T's career was. She was a mainstream actress for like 20 years, from what I could tell, and had been produced by some of the bigger studios throughout the decades. It occurred to me that this crackhead burnout probably still received checks for some of this stuff. Now the guy behind me made sense. As I said, I did it. That was it. I told him it'd take me a minute to wring them all out. He asked what I meant by that. I said a charge for all the films. I explained I couldn't just let 80 or 90 tapes disappear from our store. The guy picks up the bin of movies with one arm, slides a pistol out of his waistband with the other, looks me up and down, sets the barrel on the counter, then asks me if we're good. I just nod with a sigh, tell him to take care. I called my boss after I saw them leave the parking lot, who in turn told me to call the police. Both of them showed up 20 minutes later. The police took a statement, and my boss filed a report of robbery, then fired me right there on the spot. I've thought a lot about that guy, who he was, and why they wanted those movies. For the past couple of years, I've had the same job. I'm a janitor for a popular fast food restaurant. I don't take orders or do anything aside from cleaning. I don't even see other workers a lot of the time because I'm scheduled overnight. At the restaurant, everything needs to be deep cleaned every day, and during open hours, it's basically impossible to do. I'd never had anything happen during my shifts aside from the occasional customer knocking on the window asking if we're open. On this night, I came in and got to work like I usually did. A couple of other employees were still there when I got there, but by 10, which was an hour after closing, it was just me for the rest of the night. I popped in my headphones and started scraping the grills and prepping everything that needed to be hosed down. After a while, I lost track of time, but my best guess is that it was around 12 a.m. when I heard a knock at the front of the building. I pulled off my headphones, hearing it again. I walked to the front, expecting someone at the door, wanting to see if we were closed, but when I looked, nobody was there. I went up to the door and looked out at the parking lot, no cars or people. I knew I'd heard it from this side of the building though, so I waited for it again, but there was nothing. I ended up thinking I just mistook another sound for knocking and went back to work. Another hour or so went by, and then I took a lunch break. I grabbed my lunch bag and sat at one of the tables in the middle of the dining area, taking my time since I was actually ahead on my cleaning. Once I finished eating, I went to the back and turned to grab the mop, only to see a man's face staring at me from outside the drive-through window. He had messy hair and a blank face, but his eyes had something strange about them, like they were empty. I froze up for a second, and after a moment, the man calmly turned and walked away. My heart was racing in my chest, and I just stood in place, listening to his departing footsteps. I didn't know what to think. It was just incredibly creepy and strange. Once I got my confidence back, I opened the window and looked out to make sure he left. It was dark beyond the light of the restaurant, but I didn't see anyone, so I closed it up and locked it. I was on edge for the next hour, constantly looking behind me at the windows, feeling like I was being watched. But as my shift was coming to an end, I started to feel some relief, and the anxiety calmed down. One of the last few things I had to do was roll all the garbage bags out to the dumpster, which I was avoiding as long as I could. I checked the window before I stepped out, and it looked clear, so I quickly opened the door and got the garbage out. I started tossing them one by one into the dumpster, but not even 20 seconds in, the man appeared from around the corner. I stopped what I was doing and quickly asked what he needed. He didn't respond as he walked up to me and had that same empty stare. Now that I could see his whole body though, he was even more terrifying, being a fairly large man and wearing a dirty and stained coat. Not knowing what else to do, I ran for the door. I opened it as the man's footsteps rushed up behind me, and as I slammed the door shut, the man was able to stick his arm into the gap, preventing it from closing. I turned and sprinted to the other end of the restaurant, getting my keys out and unlocking the front door as fast as I could while hearing the man closing the distance on me. I barely got away and ran before he got to me. I sprinted across the parking lot and as far as I could while calling the police. 5 minutes later, the police got to the restaurant. The man was gone. We got footage on the CCTVs, but no identity could be made of it. It also showed that as soon as I ran away, the man just stayed there and watched me for a bit, then left out the back door. What he wanted from me is unknown, but his creepy and objectively horrifying behavior gives me chills even to this day. was working late at the office one night. We have a big 2-story building in a business complex, and sometimes if we have to catch up on work, we kind of have to stay late. I had taken 2 sick days the week before, so I really had to get my project done and didn't have much time left to do it. I planned to stay a few hours this night and a few hours the next night to get caught up, leaving anywhere between 1 and 2 a.m. Often others would be there late as well, but this night it was just me. I was working at my desk, which was in the middle of a room full of desks. As I typed away on my laptop, I started to get a little drowsy. After fighting it for a bit, I got up to make some coffee in the break room. I started the machine and leaned against the table, barely keeping my eyes open as it slowly poured into the mug. A sudden thud shook me awake. It sounded like it was downstairs, but it was really loud, resonating through the whole building. Nothing followed the sound though, it was just the one thud. I walked over to the doorway and looked out at the stairs, debating whether or not to see what it was. Honestly, I was so tired I thought it had to just be something falling in one of the rooms downstairs and chose not to investigate. I grabbed my mug and went back to my desk, continuing to work. I sat there for an hour non-stop working, but the coffee really wasn't fixing my sleepiness problem. I kept working, trying to power through it, but I was only prolonging the inevitable. At some point, I dozed off at my desk. When my eyes opened, I remember being immediately irritated and somewhat dizzy, like I'd been annoyingly woken up from a deep sleep. As I regained my senses, I noticed a sound coming from somewhere in the building. It was a beep, sounding every 4 or 5 seconds, but very faint. I looked at my laptop. Seeing it was nearly 2 a.m., I decided it wasn't worth trying to work anymore. So I packed up my things and brought them with me as I left the room to both check on the beeping and to leave afterwards. As I got to the stairwell, the beeping started to make me nervous. I'd never heard it before, and there was something eerie about it. Maybe I was too tired before to fully comprehend it. I walked down the staircase, and now with the beeping much louder, I peered into the long main hallway. At the far end, there was a metal rod laying on the ground right in front of the open entrance door. I felt blood rush from my face, knowing it should be locked up and realizing the beeping was from the building's security system. With nothing but instinct to go off of, I ran to the opposite end of the hallway and out the back door, getting in my car to call for help. Although I was out of the building, what I learned next was far more terrifying. Police pulled in and searched around, not finding anyone or anything. When we checked the security cameras at 11 p.m., a man could be seen walking up and breaking the door open with a single hit from some kind of tool, creating the bang sound that I heard while getting coffee. He then quietly moved around the first floor and up to the second, where he came into the office I was in and stood quietly only a few feet behind me while I was working at my desk. He then went back downstairs, coming up again while I was sleeping, and walked around the whole office, even going right up to me and searching around my desk. It's not clear if he stole anything, as there weren't cameras in every room, but there didn't seem to be any obvious answer as to what he was doing there. After seeing the security tapes, I've never stayed alone at that office again. I'm retired now, but for a couple of years in my 50s, I worked a night shift in a mall. I was a custodian and would come in and clean once the mall had closed for the night. Most of my nights were spent cleaning up the food court areas, as well as taking care of bathrooms. One night I was sweeping the floor in the food court area, and I heard a fit of coughing coming from somewhere. I looked around the dimly lit food court area but didn't see anyone. A couple of times throughout my years working there, I would discover somebody or a group of people who had hidden in the mall and were doing a challenge of staying there overnight. I didn't see anyone and heard no further noises, so I just continued cleaning. If someone was trying to stay in the mall overnight, I'd see them eventually unless they stayed put in one spot the entire time. About 15 minutes had passed and I was wiping off tables. Suddenly, a series of loud bangs startled me. I looked up and saw that a whole table and all the surrounding chairs had been knocked over onto the ground. I walked over to the items on the ground, which had happened near the edge of the food court. There was no one to be seen anywhere. I ventured down away from the food court a bit to see if I could see anyone running away or hiding. I was about to turn around back to the food court when I heard water running inside the women's bathroom. All the bathrooms at the mall had sinks that were motion sensors. Someone had to be inside of the bathroom, and I had a feeling that it was going to be the culprit I was looking for from the food court. The sink was still running as I slowly and as quietly as I could entered the bathroom. As I turned the corner into the bathroom, the water abruptly stopped running. There was nobody anywhere to be seen. I checked every stall and still nothing. I chalked it up to a faulty sensor on the sink and decided that I'd put in a work order for maintenance to fix it. Oddly enough, as I walked away from the bathroom, I heard the sink turn on again. I walked back to the food court very confused and also a little spooked. I went about the rest of my night as usual, finishing my cleaning duties. A couple of days later, I received an email from maintenance that there had been nothing wrong with the sink sensor and that it was functioning normally. From then on, at least once a week, I would hear the water running from the sink in that bathroom. For the rest of the time that I worked at the mall, I just accepted that I wasn't alone in that mall and stayed away from that bathroom. I never had any more incidents with the mysterious knocking over tables and chairs in the food court. Thankfully, that spirit or whatever it was stayed in the women's bathroom. I used to work night shift security, and by far the scariest thing I ever encountered was when I chanced upon a robbery in progress. I was patrolling one of our assets around the start of my shift at 10 p.m., walking around the perimeter of the building. Everything looked in order except an air conditioner near ground level that had fallen out of place. The air conditioner didn't fit well in the hole, so there had been a wooden plank to prop it up and keep it in place. I assumed that the stick had somehow been nudged and the AC unit had fallen out of place. It wasn't very heavy, so I propped the air conditioner back into its hole in the wall, positioning the stick to keep it in place. I continued my walk around the building, reaching the next window, and to my surprise, someone was there. The light in the room wasn't on, but there was a bit of light entering the room from the hallway that the office space was connected to. It wasn't uncommon for a worker to be working late on a project or either use their code to re-enter the building and grab something they had forgotten earlier. I pressed my face to the glass to see who it was and if I would recognize them. Once I was peering through the glass, I could make out that it definitely wasn't an office worker. The person was wearing a ski mask over their face. They noticed my face pressed up against the window and hustled out of the room. Realizing that a robbery was in progress, I quickly put two and two together, figuring out that the fallen air conditioning unit hole was most likely the way they had entered the building. I immediately pressed a button on my phone in an app that my company used to notify police if they needed to send cars to my location. I was still standing only about 100 feet away from the AC unit, so I ran over to see if that was going to be how the perpetrator would attempt to escape. Sure enough, shortly after I had reached the AC unit, it came flying out at me as the intruder pushed it forcefully from inside. The AC unit was knocked straight backwards into my chest, and I watched as the person in the ski mask flew through the hole in the wall, barreling into me and the AC unit that I had somehow managed to catch. The suspect ran into a nearby neighborhood, but the police arrived soon after and had them cornered in a city block, shutting down the entire street and eventually capturing them. It felt good to say that I had stopped an attempted robbery in progress, but I'll never forget the image of the person flying through a dark hole in the wall directly into me. It was quite terrifying, and I had nightmares about it for the next couple of nights. I work at a gas station in the center of my town. My shifts aren't always the same, but I find myself on overnights and early mornings most of the time. I'd been there for a whole year at this point, and honestly, I didn't have many negative things to say about it. It was just a normal mid-paying job that only required me to stand in one spot for 8 hours and talk to the occasional customer. On this day, I was working an overnight shift, the typical 10 to 6. Although it's usually not too busy overnight on weekdays, it's worth mentioning that it was raining a decent amount this night, so I was expecting it to be a pretty quiet night. The first couple of hours, I sat in a chair behind the register and just waited for anyone to come in. I got a few people who paid for gas with cash, but by 12:30 or 1-ish, it was pretty much dead. No customers were coming inside and barely anyone was even getting gas outside. With absolutely no customers, I went around the counter and started fixing up the shelves a bit. They weren't too bad, but it was just a way to keep myself busy. As I was doing this, I had my back facing the windows, but I saw headlights glare through the store as someone pulled into the pumping stations. I didn't look because there was nothing interesting about it, just some guy pulling in to get gas. I kept on tidying up the shelves for maybe 10 or so minutes before I unconsciously glanced out the window. The car was still there by one of the pumps, with a man standing right next to it. As soon as I looked, the man shifted away, making it obvious that he was looking at me. After seeing that, I felt really weirded out, especially since they'd been there supposedly pumping gas for a whole 10 minutes. I went back to the counter, then checked out the window again 30 seconds later, seeing the man getting in his car. The headlights flashed a few times like he was trying and failing to turn it on, but he eventually got it running and drove away in a hurry. I stood there and just looked out the window for a minute, and something just really didn't seem right. I got an idea and pulled up the recent transactions for the pump he was at. The last time it was used was hours ago. He was there for 10 minutes, with no reason at all other than watching me through the windows. I stayed behind the counter for a while, trying to just wait out the rest of my shift. A few more cars came and went, and then it got really quiet again for a while. Around 3 a.m., I heard something outside. The rain was heavy, but a rhythmic shuffling noise on the ground was barely audible through its footsteps right along the side of the building, moving toward the back. I tried to look out the window, but there was no good view. I did notice that no cars were in the parking lot, or by the pumps though. I quickly left the counter and went to the back door, which was a heavy metal door that had no windows or anything on it. I pressed my ear against it and listened as the footsteps got louder and louder until they were right on the other side of the door. My eyes moved to the handle, waiting in the silence before the handle turned slowly and slightly, but it got caught by the lock. It went quiet again for almost a whole minute. Then a man's voice grunted in frustration as a sudden sharp sound slid across the other side of the door. Footsteps followed soon after, leaving and going back to the side of the gas station. I ran back to the front, waiting to see them walking away, but didn't get any sight of them. Acting quickly, I picked up the store phone and dialed 911, hoping they could catch him before he got too far. I didn't know what was really happening, but someone trying to get in through the back door had to have intended something bad. When the cops arrived, they didn't find the man, but they did find a car on the side of the road less than a quarter-mile away, the same car I'd seen earlier with the man who was watching me. It had run out of gas and had mismatching license plates. It turned out to be a stolen car from 2 states over. The other thing they found was a long scrape across the back door, made by a sharp metal object, likely a knife. Knowing all these details, I think I actually got extremely lucky, as the man was probably on the run already and could have been planning something bad. I spend the nights working as a security officer. My job is to travel around to various buildings, mostly businesses that hire my company for security. I swing by each of these places multiple times at night, ensuring that nothing funny is going on and the building is secure. Honestly, my job is really boring, as you can picture that on a night-to-night basis. Not much is going on around an office building. I'm required to walk around each entry point to the building, making sure that it's locked and secure. I have keys to all these buildings in case I need to go inside, but in the 3 months working this night shift, I never had to go inside a building. However, that all changed during a shift I had 2 weeks ago. I had reached my third building of the night, which was a smaller 4-story office building. I made my rounds around the perimeter of the building, shining my light up at windows, ensuring they were intact, and pulling on doors, making sure they were locked. I circled around to the backside of the building. When I did, I was shocked to see that a door was not only unlocked but also propped open. I never had to deal with a situation like this before, and, quite frankly, I was nervous to go inside the building. I maneuvered my way through the building, moving very slowly and shining my flashlight into every room and corner. It took me a while, especially since I was nervous, but I made my way through all 4 floors of the building without seeing anything unusual. I made my way back to the door that had been left open, removing the prop in the door and locking it behind me. I continued my rounds, making my way through the rest of the buildings that needed to be checked for the night. I decided to head back over to the office building that I had walked through earlier to make sure that everything was okay. I pulled my truck into the parking lot and began walking around the building, doing rounds once more. To my surprise, the same back exit was once again unlocked and propped open. At this point, I was very confused. There wasn't supposed to be anyone still in the building this late, and there were no lights inside that I could see. I reluctantly entered the office building once again and searched it from top to bottom, this time even calling out multiple times to see if anyone was there. Once again, I saw and heard nothing unusual my entire trip throughout the building. I returned to the back exit and saw that the door was now closed. I hadn't unpropped the door when I first entered the building, but now the door was closed and the brick that had been used to prop it open was nowhere in sight. Again, this was my first time having to enter a building while I had this job, so I was a little scared at this point. I quickly locked the door and hurried back to the safety of my truck. Nobody was supposed to be in that building, so I was relieved that I hadn't ended up seeing anybody during my rounds of the building. It was eerie to me, though, that during both of my searches at the building, somebody had been in there somewhere, evading me, and then slipped out the back door without me seeing them. I called the office building the next day, asking if anything important was missing or had been stolen, but nothing they were aware of was gone. I still currently work the security night shift job, but haven't had any nights like that one at the office building since then. Back when I was in university, I worked nights at a pub a few miles from my parents' house. We lived in the countryside, so I had to commute to nearby Leeds on weekday mornings. On weekends, I spent my nights earning much-needed beer money. When my late shift at the pub ended, I had to walk about 2.5 miles along narrow, poorly lit country lanes to get home. We had a taxi service in the nearby village, but on weekends it was pretty much fully booked. Besides, I didn't want to spend my nightly wages on a taxi. One of the great things about working in countryside pubs was the phenomenal tips. The sense of community and old-fashioned values meant that farm hands and landed gentry alike always tipped on their orders. Sometimes it was just 20 pence, but occasionally they'd leave 4 or 5 pounds of change, especially when they'd had a few too many and were feeling generous. My shifts usually ended at about 11:30 p.m. once last orders had been called and we'd cleaned down the bars. All the staff would usually hang around for a drink until about midnight before going our separate ways. One Saturday had been particularly busy. The weather was spectacular, and there had been some kind of garden festival in the area. This meant all kinds of people from near and far had visited the pub, adding to my tips. By the end of the night, I had €112. It was more money than I'd ever had in my life, and I didn't want to waste any of it on a taxi. A belly full of lager would see me home with no problems. So off I went, merrily meandering home, feeling like a very rich man as I planned how to spend my newfound fortune. It was dark out, really dark, with only a sliver of the moon to light my way, but I was too buzzed and cheerful to care. About a mile into the journey home, I was blasting some AC/DC in my earphones when I saw the lights of a car coming up behind me. It passed slowly at first, and I thought the driver might ask for directions, but the car just kept going. Since the festival was on, I thought nothing of not recognizing the vehicle or its driver. But once the car had passed me by about 200 yards, it just stopped in the middle of the road. I watched it sit there for a minute, continuing on my way until it dawned on me that it wasn't going to just drive off. I got the weirdest feeling that it was waiting for me. I know that sounds paranoid, but sometimes you just get a bad feeling about something, a tight feeling in your stomach that tells you something is badly wrong. So I stopped walking and stood at the side of the road, staring at the car's rear lights until it finally revved its engine and took off into the night. I wasn't freaked out, thanks to the beer. If this had happened while I was sober, I'd have been much more scared. I'm not a tough guy at all. So when a couple of minutes later I saw a pair of headlights coming at me from the opposite side of the road, I wasn't worried. I just kept walking as the car passed me, but I realized it was the same car from before. Just like before, it stopped a couple of 100 yards down the road from me. I was now convinced it was a car full of city folks who had managed to get lost in the dark. Again, I stopped at the side of the road, waiting for it to reverse so the driver could ask for directions, but it didn't. The car did a U-turn in the middle of the lane, then switched off its headlights and began to creep slowly down the road towards me. I wasn't freaked out before, but I was then. I was completely and utterly terrified. I had no idea what the driver's intentions were, but they were obviously not good. My head was spinning with grim ideas of what they were planning: robbery, kidnapping, or worse. I just started running, looking for a gap in the hedgerows so I could jump into one of the nearby fields to hide. I finally found one, scrambling over the dry stone wall and badly scraping my elbows in the process. My first thought was to grab my phone from my backpack to call the police, but the light from the screen meant the driver would find me quickly. I panicked, threw it back in my bag, and decided hiding was my best option. Even if I got through to the police, it would take them a while to get there, and it might be too late by then. So I crouched at the base of the hedge, terrified, just trying to hide so the driver would think I'd run off over the fields. The only thing I could rely on at that point was my sense of hearing. I was listening for footsteps, the car's engine, anything to give me an idea of what was happening on the other side of the hedge. A couple of minutes felt like half an hour, and in that time I hadn't heard a single thing from the road. When it felt safe to check, I started to slowly edge towards the section of hedge I'd jumped over, ready to peek over the dry stone wall for any signs of the car. Right then I heard the sound of car doors slamming, not one door, but two or three, all closing at once. The car hadn't moved that whole time they'd been sitting in the middle of a dark country lane, waiting for me to emerge. My heart was pounding. I can't convey how terrifying it is to know you're being hunted by a gang of complete strangers. I just bolted, hurtling across the dark field towards a small wooded area. I knew the area well, so despite not knowing exactly where I'd end up, it didn't matter. It was either run or face being caught by the guys hunting me. I hid out in the woods for as long as I could, watching the field I'd just crossed for shadows or torches, but again, there was nothing. When the coast was clear, I took off in the opposite direction, crossing fields and staying off the roads until I found my way back home. Even though it was the middle of the night, I woke my mom and dad and told them exactly what had happened. Naturally, they called the police and arranged for some officers to visit the next morning so I could give a description. A month or so went by, and we heard nothing. I'd stopped walking home and started paying for taxes to ensure I got back safe. I was managing to forget about what had happened, or at least let it slip to the back of my mind. That's when the police called back. The guys had been arrested for committing an assault on an elderly man just a few villages away from us. They were part of a gang based in nearby Leeds, where I went to university, that would drive out into the country at night, where there were hardly any CCTV cameras, before assaulting people as part of some initiation. I was glad they'd been caught, but it still bothers me that some people are so willing to commit violence against a total stranger. I still walk places at night sometimes, but I don't use noise-canceling headphones anymore, and I always carry a small penknife just in case. If you work night shifts, I'd recommend you do the same. You never know who's out there lurking in the darkness, just waiting to make someone a victim.